All right, greetings. I want to take the time to welcome you to our new series, Trauma Resilience is the One Up. I am Reverend Dr. Shalita Mira. I am a senior pastor, a psychologist, and a licensed clinical social worker who is passionate about educating the community. And that is the purpose of this series. The goal of this series is to create more trauma resilient communities. And trauma resilience really starts at the space of education. We find that in our community, so many individuals do not understand trauma, do not understand the impact of trauma on their minds, their bodies, and their spirits. And they don't understand how trauma impacts their future behavior by keeping them in bondage to the past. And so I'm delighted to begin this multi-part series with the goal of just simply equipping you with more information on how we can become more trauma resilient. The reality of it is that 70% of individuals in the United States have experienced some life-altering or traumatic situation or event. And that further propounds the need to have these conversations. And so I hope that you would join me as we journey through understanding trauma so that we can take better care of our mental health, which impacts our physical health, which impacts our spiritual health, which impacts how we show up in the world. So on today's agenda, we're going to be simply looking at how do we become trauma resilient and what is trauma? And then our next series is going to focus on triggers. And we're going to use acronyms to make sure that we understand how to identify these triggers. And then the next series is going to focus on how we cope with trauma. And then from there, we are going to spend some time discussing healing. Again, it's a scaffolded process because we cannot change what we don't understand. And even moving toward the space of healing begins with learning how first to identify it within our bodies, identify it in our life, then learning ways to help us manage it so that the symptoms can decrease. And then the overall goal is creating healing, individual healing, communal healing, national healing. So that is our goal here. So Resmaa Menakem, who is a therapist, he is a Black somatic abolitionist, a trauma specialist, and an author, describing himself as a cultural trauma navigator, penned these words in his text entitled My Grandmother's Hands. And he said, the reality is that we are bodies, born of bodies, bodies feeding other bodies, bodies sharing intimacy with other bodies. We are bodies seeking a shoulder to lean or cry on. We are bodies, and our bodies matter, which is why anything related to them arouses emotions. And this is slightly modified. And so that is a great work to read. If you have not read Resmaa Menakem's work, My Grandmother's Hands, I encourage you to check it out because it talks about trauma in the Black body, the white body, and the police body. So there are 4 R's to trauma resilience, and some leading scholars have all come together identifying these 4 aspects of building trauma resilience. The first is realization. We must first realize the widespread impact of trauma, stress, and adversity on our entire being, and not just on us individually, but how it affects our family, how it affects our communities, how it affects our state and our nation, how it affects the world. We must have this realization. So this is the first place that we are going to really focus on creating awareness, right? And so we have to understand this widespread impact, and we have to understand then the potential impacts and the paths for healing and recovery. Then there's recognition. So we have to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma individually, familially, systemically, and collectively in order to resist re-traumatization. Whether we realize it or not, there are some patterns. Individually, there's some patterns in our family. There's some patterns in some of the systems that we interact in, whether it's schools, whether it's churches, whether it's community organizations, where in our attempts to address or even combat trauma, we are re-traumatizing. And so what we want to do then is we want to make sure that we're equipped with effective ways to resist this re-traumatization. And then we want to be able to respond. So we respond by intentionally embedding and infusing knowledge about trauma, along with effective coping strategies and healing strategies, which is why this particular workshop, this particular resource is scaffolded in the way that it is so that there can be an unfolding of transformative knowledge so that we can recognize, so that we can resist re-traumatization, and then so that we can respond through coping and through healing. So now let's look at trauma. What is trauma? How do we define trauma? And the reality of it is we have so many different definitions. And so this particular section of our workshop, of this resource, serves to define trauma. So trauma is, according to research, is generally defined as this overwhelming experience or event that exceeds an individual's capacity to cope, and it disrupts their sense of safety and well-being. It often involves a threat to one's physical or psychological integrity and can lead to this lasting emotional, cognitive, and physiological effect or impact. Trauma response occurs when there is the perception of danger or a threat. But this threat is more than just to the well-being of our bodies. It can be a threat to what we do, what we think, what we say. It could be a threat to our voice. It can be a threat to what we care about, what we believe in, what we yearn for. It can be a threat to our present or even to our future. The term trauma, wound, it goes all the way back to Greek antiquity. And the range of meanings attested at the time included being severely hurt, physical wounds or wounding. We associate that a lot to PTSD and military, but also these psychic wounds. Gabor Mate, who is a trauma practitioner, along with the very scriptures that we find in not only the Christian Bible, but in other religious texts, really speak to the effect of this deep wounding on our being. So Gabor Mate states that trauma is not what happens to you, but it is what happens inside of you as a result of what has happened to you. And so we are going to briefly review some of the types of trauma so that by the end of today's time together, you have a greater understanding of the multifaceted modalities in which trauma can impact our lives. So the first one we're going to look at is acute trauma. So acute trauma refers to a single traumatic event, such as a car accident, natural disaster, or physical assault. And it occurs within a relatively short time frame. So acute trauma is usually isolated, has short duration, and it's single incident, but it still has reverberating, lasting, and profound effects. Then we have chronic trauma. And chronic trauma involves a prolonged or repeated exposure to a traumatic event. So some examples of chronic trauma include ongoing domestic violence or child abuse, living in a war zone, or living in impoverished or crime-ridden communities. Bullying can also be a form of chronic trauma, because what it does is it creates this lens in this worldview that normalizes certain neurologically stimulating events and activities, but it also perpetuates this internal narrative that we're never going to escape. And the chronic trauma, when it activates our autonomic nervous system and places us in the space of fight or flight, we find that there are repeated and long-lasting impacts from this chronic trauma. Complex trauma is the result of experiencing multiple and or prolonged traumatic events, often in the context of interpersonal relationships. So it looks very similar then to chronic trauma, but the space of safety becomes more intimate. So it typically occurs during childhood and can include neglect, physical or sexual abuse, and emotional maltreatment. So it takes the duration, but it's more complex in that it occurs in these intimate spaces where safety should exist, but we find that it does not. And post-traumatic stress disorder. This is one that is very familiar to us all. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is a specific psychological disorder that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. It involves a range of symptoms to include intrusive memories and thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, where you have this heightened startle response. You scare very easily. We see avoidance of anything that would remind us of that situation or incident. So oftentimes we say our war vets who've been in combat situations don't often like fireworks or loud noises or gunshots because they have an exaggerated startle response. They're extremely hypervigilant, and it can trigger flashbacks and also emotional distress. Then vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma refers to the emotional and psychological changes that occur within an individual who is indirectly exposed to the traumatic experiences of others. So when we hear vicarious trauma, we are primarily discussing or talking about how it affects professionals who are in the helping profession. So we think about law enforcement officers, medical professionals, EMS, therapists, pastors, individuals who are in those professions. The term vicarious implies that the trauma is experienced indirectly through hearing about it, maybe witnessing it through sensory means, or empathically engaging with a traumatic story or experience of another. But also similar to the vicarious trauma that is experienced more in the professional realm is secondary trauma. And secondary trauma is all that we just discussed, but it is on more of a lay or individual or even in our communal lens. It's what we experience just as human beings, right? So secondary traumatic stress refers to the emotional and psychological symptoms experienced by individuals who are indirectly exposed to trauma through their close relationships with friends or colleagues or other trauma survivors, right? So similar to the vicarious trauma, secondary trauma arises from this empathetic engagement or exposure to the traumatic experiences of others. The term secondary emphasizes that the trauma is experienced secondhand as a result of being closely connected to an individual. And it still perpetuates the intense symptoms of intrusive thoughts, emotional distress, hypervigilance, changes in how we see our own emotional or physical well-being. It changes our identity. It changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we see our communities. It changes our identity. And it can also precipitate alterations in how we perceive safety and trust. Secondary trauma can be experienced through watching something on the news, right? Think about every time you turn on the news or Facebook or some other social media platform and you see injustice, whether it's police brutality, whether it is community violence, whether it is political innuendos that are shameful or demeaning. Those things have an impact on us individually. It shifts our worldview. It has a trauma inducing response on us individually, collectively. That's why we have to talk about these various types of trauma. Developmental trauma is trauma that occurs during childhood and can result from chronic abuse, neglect, or disruptions in attachment and caregiving relationships. It can have profound and lasting effects on a child's psychological and emotional development. And there's been a lot of study in what's called ACEs, and ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So adverse childhood experiences are stressful or traumatic experiences that have a huge impact on children and young people throughout their lives, and actually is a determinant of how an individual will experience life during adulthood. So there are 10 widely recognized ACEs as identified in the US study from the 1990s, and these are physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical and emotional neglect. And this looks at individuals who are growing up in households where there are adults with alcohol and substance use problems, individuals who are growing up in homes with individuals who struggle with mental illness, or there's domestic violence, where there are adults who spent time in prison, or they've been separated from their parental unit. And so I will do a future training that really delves into the ACEs more in depth. But for the purposes of this particular educational seminar and workshop, developmental training includes ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And then we have collective trauma. So collective trauma refers to the psychological and emotional impact experienced by a group or a community following a shared traumatic event. We think about, we just had, for the purposes of this recording, we're in September, and 9/11 just recently passed, and that's an example of a shared traumatic event. In Florida, we just went through a life-changing hurricane. So we think about weather anomalies and events, natural disasters affecting us, and also think about mass shooting. Think about violence on churches and other houses of worship. Think about community violence. This we experience collectively, and that is collective trauma. Then race-based injury and traumatic paradigms. So race-based traumatic stress is the traumatic response of stress following a racial encounter. And our race-based injury and traumatic paradigms have really come to the forefront in the most recent years. And we see that Robert T. Carter's theory of race-based traumatic stress implies that there are individuals of color who experience these racially charged discriminatory actions against them, and these are traumatic. We think about microaggressions and macroaggressions, and they often generate responses similar to that which is experienced in those who have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So race-based traumatic stress speaks to the unique physiological, psychological, and emotional distress that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, what we call our BIPOC communities, suffer as a result of racism and discrimination. These experiences can be macro, which are huge when we think about systemically, we think about politics, we think about what's going on in our nation. It could be meso, which is how we experience it on our jobs or in other systems that we have to navigate through, whether it be insurance, whether it be in houses of worship, in schools. And then on a micro level, which is more individually. Macroaggressions include society-level events or policies that are racist and could include overrepresentations of African Americans in the criminal justice system and police brutality. So we think about the murders of Americans like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Meso-level aggressions can compromise our communities, for example. We think about the prolonged water crisis in Flint, Michigan, starting in 2014. And social media has precipitated the impact of these traumas through vicarious and secondary means. And then microaggressions refer to direct individual interactions and experiences of racism, sexism, heterosexism, nationalism, and these can include people clutching their purses, when walking past young African-American men or asking someone who is racially diverse where they are from. And so we see here that race-based injury, while it has not made its way into the diagnostic and statistical manual of disorders, we're hoping to see it soon, because the symptoms of race-based injury and traumatic paradigms has such a profound effect on the BIPOC community. So this ends our first session, which is an overview of trauma, defining trauma, and the types of trauma. In our next episode, we are going to look at the trauma response, and we're going to spend some time talking about the vagal or the soul nerve and our automatic nervous system and how it responds when we are exposed to traumatic incidents. It is my prayer that this particular installment of this training will serve to educate you and provide you with some much needed insight and revelation on trauma and the multifaceted doors by which we experience trauma individually, collectively, communally, and nationally.